On the subject of the economy, the untold story, please, massive round of applause for Barry Kushner.
Thank you very much. I was going to do, as you were talking, I thought it might be worth doing some audience participation economics until they just got up and left, so I'm not going to do that. So the economy, the untold story, what's all that about? Well, I think what it's about is that we're told, and we've been told for so long now. I've been doing these talks for over 18. We've been told for so long now that about certain things to do with our country and our economy that it's kind of, you say something often enough, people believe it, don't they? So I think the things that, you know, we're on the brink of bankruptcy, we're paying more in debt repayments than we pay on education, that it's unsustainable what we're doing. There's no alternative to the austerity program that's being introduced. So as a result of that, it can't possibly be, you know, especially us with such inquiring minds, that there can only be one way of seeing things. It can't be the one way of seeing things. And there's an antidote to that. You've got, I found when you start digging around, you find economists. These are all Nobel Prize winning economists. And these are all people who are independent in the sense that none of them work for Goldman Sachs. But these guys, one of them headed the World Bank. One of them was a British, Christopher Pissarides is a British economist who won the Nobel Prize last year for economics. And they're saying that what we're being told is not true, it's not right. You know, Krugman says it's jobs now, deficit later. So all these are completely different messages from different types of economists that run completely against what we're being told about our economy, what we're being told and what we still are. And seeing as you're a philosophy, there's an undertone of philosophy in what you're doing. I should say that Aesop said that every truth has two sides to it, and it is as well to look at both before we commit ourselves to either. So this is looking at a challenge to what is the single narrative around our own economy. And I have to say that all this information that I've got here is all provided and found through simple Google searches. So that's how deep the narrative is in terms of I'm not an economist, by the way. And when you start looking at what's actually happening in our economy, this is what they said about borrowing. This is borrowing. So the government, when it came in May 2010, told us that we needed to get hold of our deficit because otherwise the country was on the brink of bankruptcy. So this actually, since then, there have been 3 revisions to how much borrowing we're going to have to make as a country over the next 4 or 5 years, extended even for 7 years, and we're actually going to borrow 150 million, more or less, billion pounds more than was originally forecast. 150 billion pounds more than was originally forecast. That, as an estimate by our Chancellor of the Exchequer, is almost 50% out from where his original forecast was. The other one is our growth. There were growth predictions when the austerity program was put together in October, presented to us in October 2010. We said that the economy was going to flourish, going to reduce public spending, the private sector was going to charge in, and then it was going to lead to great growth in the economy. Well, our growth this year was forecast, as you can see, at 2.1%. Sorry, 2.6%. And we're going to be lucky this year if it's anywhere near 0.1%. So these are predictions based on all the information that you've got to hand in the Treasury, all the information that you could possibly need to make your forecasts have meant that the government, as forecasts, have been completely wrong. Completely wrong. So that sort of raises a bit of skepticism in terms of the narrative that we're being told. But in order to try and understand some of the things they're telling us, we need to understand some of the terms that are being used. And one of them, and the key one, is obviously GDP. GDP, I'll just explain what that is before I come back to this point. GDP is gross domestic product. Now, what is it? Yeah, these terms are all bandied around on television, these scientific terms. These are sort of gold standard in terms of how we interpret and analyze our own economy. What is it? Well, GDP is made up of 4 things. is made up of consumer spending, business investment, includes government spending, and it's made up of the difference between the value of what we export against the value of what we import. It's usually a negative, that one. But that's how it's calculated. And when you add all that up together, you find out the value of what we earn as a country in 1 year. Everything that we earn in a country in 1 year, and that's what the gross domestic product is. And what is it? It's about 1.559 trillion as of today, I reckon, given that it was 1.556 trillion a year ago, and we've hardly grown. So that's about what it is. That's what we earn as a country in 1 year. That incidentally is the 6th biggest gross domestic product in the whole world. In the whole world. So far from being a poor country, far from being a country that is quaking, looking over a cliff into economic abyss, we are the 6th wealthiest, highest wealth-producing country in the world. Now, the thing with looking at debt is that you can only really measure debt and compare it from 1 year to another, between one country and another, if you measure it as a percentage of the gross domestic product. Okay? So why do you do that? Well, if you wanted to know you want to know whether a car was more expensive today than it was 20 years ago, then you compare a price of a similar car today with what the average income is today. And then you compare the same with what it was 20 years ago. And when you work it out, you know one percentage from one to the other, you know whether it's more expensive or not. Well, working out debt as a percentage of our gross domestic product is exactly the same. And it's used as a standard tool. It's used by economies right across the world, by treasury departments. And that's the method they use to calculate, work out whether debt is high, it's low, it's manageable, not manageable, all the kind of things that we never really consider or speak about when we're talking about our economy, do we? No one talks in those terms to us. So, what's our national debt? Well, we're told our debt is higher than it's ever been. I mean, of course it is in terms of pounds and pence, but after all, a pint of beer is more expensive than it's ever been, because that's the nature of economies. Everything goes up, wages go up, things you buy go up, everything is proportionate one to the other. So, our debt at the moment, as a percentage of our gross domestic product, is 64.5%. 64.5%. So if our GDP is 1.559 trillion, that means that our debt is just over £1 trillion. Just over £1 trillion. Now, is that manageable? Is that unmanageable? Is that sustainable for us as a country? Is it unsustainable for us as a country? Well, that's the question that we need to, that's not posed to us. We're not involved in a discussion about those kind of things. But I just tell you this, that when we signed the Maastricht Treaty, the EU set an upper limit on what countries should have as debt that it could tolerate, and it was 60%. It was 60%. It's only gone up to 64.5% in the last year or so. That's because we haven't grown as an economy, but obviously our spending has increased a bit. So that's why it's taken us over 64.5%, because obviously we've got a deficit, and I'll come back to that later on. So that suggests to me we're pretty close, aren't we, to the EU limit. But do you know what? Quantitative easing. There's something for you to think about tonight when you're going home. Quantitative easing. Basically, the Bank of England has been buying bonds, our government bonds. Governments borrow money by issuing a bond, like a premium bond. A bank buys it, and we say to the bank, right, you give us that bond for 10 years, and the bond will cost you £5 billion. You give us that bond for 10 years, I'll give you an interest payment every year. At the end of 10 years, I'll give you your £10 billion back. That's the way governments borrow money. Right now, what the Bank of England has been doing with quantitative easing is it's been buying the bonds that RBS Bank, HSBC Bank, Lloyds TSB Bank, all those banks that have been buying government bonds, the Bank of England have been shoveling money into them and buying them back off them. So in effect, that is £375 billion, by the way. £375 billion. What could you do with that in your pocket? Well, that £375 billion, in effect, is money that we owe to ourselves, is it not? You may have noticed this week, I don't know whether you noticed, but, and this is a sleight of hand that the Chancellor will do over the next few weeks, just watch it, is that the Bank of England have said that government, you see, we've bought all these bonds now off the banks, we have them. So the bonds that you gave the banks, we've got them. But the money that you would have had to pay the banks every year, the interest payments, you now owe to us. But instead of paying us, because we don't need that money, you can have it back. You can have it back. And that the Bank of England will give the government back £35 billion. Just wait and see what the government does with that money. But that in effect, if you take that £375 billion off the £1 trillion, our debt as a percentage of GDP comes down to about 40%. Comes down to around 40%. These are not figures that should cause us to be on the brink of bankruptcy. Here's an interesting one. Our debt as a percentage of GDP has been higher for 200 out of the last 250 years. So our debt has been higher for 200 out of the last 250 years. This is a graph of what it's been like over the last 100 years. And as you can see, we're at the low end of that. 64% is the low end. If you look at where it peaks, that's in 1946. Our debt in 1946, when we came out of the war, was 238%. It was 238%. And yet, after the war, what did we do? We built the welfare state. We built hospitals. We built houses. We rebuilt the country after the destruction of war, of the Second World War. And that's when we had a debt of 238%. So that suggests to me a debt of 64% is not high and as disastrous as we're being led to believe. And what's more, when you look at all our trading partners, it's not just the case now, it's been the case for a few years now. Our debt as a percentage of GDP is lower than all our trading partners. Japan's over 200%. America is over 100%. The interesting one there is Canada. If you have a look across the world, Canada's debt there is about 85%. Now, Canada is the government's model for its austerity program. Because in the 1990s, Canada decided to do the same thing that we're doing, except obviously the economy, world economy was in a very different place then. But they decided to do the same, to reduce the level of public spending as a percentage of our GDP down from around 40% to below that. This is what this government is trying to do. Now, they did that, and they've come through it, and yet their debt is still higher than ours. So have we really got a debt that's totally unmanageable? So that's the debt. Right, there's the deficit. Now, we're told that the deficit that we have, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, the deficit that we have is caused by overspending from the last government. They maxed out the credit card. They trashed the Treasury. It was the mess that the last Labour government. I'm not arguing for I am in the Labour Party, but I'm not arguing a case for the Labour government. I've got my own criticism of that myself. But what they're saying is the mess that the Labour government left the country in is the reason why the austerity programme has to take place now, because they spent too much. Well, first of all, let's have an understanding of what deficit is. Because deficit, there's two sides to the deficit equation, as Aesop kindly referred us to think in those terms. And the one side of that is income, which is mainly coming in from taxes, but the other side is expenditure, which is mainly on public services, but also includes our debt, interest payments and things like that. So there's two sides to the economy, aren't there? To our deficit, I mean. Two sides to the deficit. So, is our spending too high, that suggests, or is our income too low? There are two sides to that equation, so just keep that in your minds as we're going through this now. Well, I want to show you this because this is a graph which shows, the bars show borrowing. So that's how much borrowing there's been since 1981, this graph is, as a percentage of gross domestic product. Again, using the same formula that they always use. So that goes back to 1981. Right, that's the first thing. Now, the line that goes up and down represents whether our finances were in deficit or whether they were in surplus. So when it's below, when that red line dips down, it actually means that we were in surplus. So the government was spending less than it was getting in. It was getting in more than it was spending, right? Now, there's a couple of things to notice from this. First of all, just visually, if you forget the period from 2010, because that's when the recession hit, the credit crunch, if you have a look at that, you can see that the red line is the last Labour government, right? Now, the level of borrowing was less than it was for 18 years of Conservative government. Alistair Darling, bless his cotton socks, in his book Beyond the Brink, which I wouldn't recommend that anybody read, but in his book Beyond the Brink, actually said that the average borrowing for the Labour government over the 12 years that it was in power was 1.2% of our GDP, 1.2%. The average borrowing throughout the whole 18 years of previous Conservative government was 3.4%. I'm not making a political point here, but I'm just saying that all through that 18 years previous to that, we weren't being told we're on the brink of bankruptcy. We're spending far too much on borrowing. The country's in a terrible mess. That was completely different. And I lived through the 80s. I can see that there's one or two people who lived through the 80s here as well. So in the 1980s, I can assure you, those who weren't living through that, the government then wasn't using money it was borrowing to spend on our infrastructure. It wasn't spending money on hospitals, on schools, on houses, on education. Those things were being cut. So even in the 1980s, it borrowed three times more than what the last Labour government borrowed. I know there's an issue of private finance, which is a separate one, but that is the case. The other thing that's worth noting is that the last government actually paid off for a period, for 4 years, more debt than the whole 18 years of the previous Conservative government did. The Labour government paid off about 4%, and the Conservative government paid off around 2%. When it was in surplus, when that line dips below there. So to suggest that the last 12 years represents overspending isn't borne out in the amount of borrowing that there's been. Because the borrowing's not been that high. Well, it's not been as high as it was in the last 18 years. So where's the deficit come from then? Well, when the credit crunch hit, 2008, 2009, shops started closing. The banks stopped lending money to banks. It foreclosed on overdrafts and things like that. Shops and businesses started closing down. Now, because they started closing down, people lost their jobs. Unemployment went up by 1 million. We forget this, but even it wasn't that long ago. Within about a year, unemployment went up by 1 million. Now, that's 1 million people not paying tax and claiming benefits. Now, that means that there's less tax coming into the government, but the spending stayed the same. Spending hasn't suddenly shot up. A hospital or a local authority or a school still needs to operate the same budget it was already set. So the spending stayed the same. It was the income that fell. And because the income fell, there was a huge deficit. So it was linked to the slump in the economy, as you can see there in 2008-9, and it fed through to high unemployment and the deficit. It had nothing to do with overspending. And if you look at it in even more detail, if you look at tax, tell you this, our deficit is around 126 billion, 130 billion odd it'll be this year, they reckon. When the Labour government left office, it was about 143 billion. It was about 143 billion. Now, if you look at what the tax take should have been, right, had there not been a recession, a credit crunch, which is that blue line that keeps going up, that's what it was forecast it should have been. People still paying their taxes, corporation tax, VAT, all that coming in. It went up like that. Now, if you look at what actually came in, which is the red line, if you look at the difference between the two, it's £100 billion. It's £100 billion. So if our deficit was 143 billion, £100 billion, you can look as a cash flow problem because people aren't working, they're not paying tax. It's got nothing to do with overspending, I would suggest. Now, if growth could increase the deficit, if a lack of growth increased the deficit, as you saw before, then is it possible that growth can reduce the deficit. Well, between July 2009 and March 2010, so July 2009 to March 2010, our economy came out of that slump and it started to grow again. It grew by 1.4%. And that was when, all the government had this fiscal stimulus. So it was pumping money into the economy. Your unemployment didn't go up to 3 million like it was forecast to be. So it led to growth. There was growth. And as a result of the growth, the deficit, which the Labour government forecast was going to be by March 2010, 2 months prior to the election, at £167 billion, as a result of the growth, actually came in at £145 billion. Now, it's still a lot of money. I haven't got £145 billion right now. But it was £22 billion less than was forecast. Now, if you think about it, the Chancellor prepared his budget 12 months before that, and then made all his calculations of what he was going to spend, what he was going to bring in income, and all of that based on a forecast deficit of £167 billion. When the government coalition government came into power in May 2010, the deficit was actually £30 billion less than it was forecast to be. £30 billion less than it was forecast to be. Now, this government, when they were in opposition, spent time with the governor of the Bank of England, working out what their proposals were going to be when they came into office. And yet, when they came in, the deficit was £30 billion less than they forecast. But what's the first thing that they did? The first thing they did was to introduce £6 billion worth of cuts. £6 billion worth of cuts within the first few months that came in, straight away. Now, and they were saying, and Vince Cable says this, and other commentators say this, and they were saying, well, we didn't know how bad the economy was before we came in. But what is there not to know? What is there not to know? All these figures, I found these figures, I've just been going through Google. I mean, if I had the Treasury to ask questions of, I'm sure I could get more detailed information. But they worked out their figures, they must have done, based on a deficit of 167 billion. So why introduce cuts of £6 billion in 1 year? Does that strike you as an economic argument? It does. It suggests these are political arguments. These are not economic arguments. Now, the other thing we're told is that that our interest payments on our debt are unmanageable. Michael Howard, who I've got a sort of a personal sort of hate obsession with, even though he supports Liverpool, I still can't stand the man. But anyway, he said, every time he's on Question Time, and he's on less and less of it now, thank God, but he says, because there's one line he keeps repeating, and the line is, we're spending £120 million every day on paying our debt interest payments. Have you heard that? Have you heard them say that? That was common. They repeated it over and over and over again. Now, where did that come from? I'll tell you where it came from. It came from what we have to pay back in interest on our borrowing as a government. It's £43 billion a year. And our borrowing is more complicated than the way they make it out. And I can tell you a bit more about that later if you want. But if you divide 43 billion by 365, you actually come to 117.8. So it's actually not 120, it's actually 117.8 million. But of course, we don't pay debt interest on a daily basis. But that to me, when I heard that, you think, my God, that's a lot of money. It's quite scary. You're thinking, that doesn't sound right. That's just ridiculous. But when you go back and have a look at it, as a percentage of our GDP, £43 billion, which is what our debt interest payments are, is around, at the time in 2010, it's a little bit less now, was about 2.8% of our GDP. 2.8% of our GDP. The point of this graph is that in 1981, what we were paying in interest on the money we were borrowing as a country was over 5%. It was over 5%. It was over 40% more than what we're paying now. So that means, on today's figures, we weren't paying £120 million a day in 1981. we were paying £174 million a day, the equivalent of £174 million a day. So where does this, it's like a deficit scare. It's not, it's an interesting thing. Why is that? Why is that difference? What is the significance of what we're paying? I'll tell you what the significance is. The significance is that £120 million a day means that our borrowing is cheap. We can borrow cheap. In fact, the government can borrow cheaper now than it's ever been able to do in any time that it's been recorded. It's the cheapest borrowing this government's had ever. Ever. And it's been low for 5, 6, 8, 9 years. So it's low. The other thing is that not only is it low, but our borrowing is not over 1 year or 2 years, it's over 10 years or 15 years. We have long-term borrowing as a country. So that poses a question to me, which is why, if we're borrowing cheap over 10 years, why do we have to close our deficit in 4 years? And Alistair Darling, well, bless his cotton socks again, why does Alistair Darling suggest that we had to reduce it by half in 4 years? Why half? Why 100%? Why not 10%? Why not 70%? Where are these figures come from? These are not figures that suggest this is part of an economic cycle, which economists, and I'm not one, tell us that takes 20, 30 years. 4 years, coincidentally, brings us to 2015, which is the time of the next election. So that's not an economic cycle, that's a political cycle. That's a political cycle. So these are not economic arguments. This suggests these are political arguments. So, and that's the point. So, do we have to make cuts? Well, that depends. Let's go back to the income. Let's go back to the income side of the deficit equation. Remember, income on one side, expenditure on the other. There's two sides to the deficit equation. As a country, we're a low-taxing country. We're a low-taxing country. So whereas in Europe, on average, the tax is around 40% of a GDP, in our country, it's about 36%. There's a lot of stories in the news, thanks to UK Uncut and the work that they're doing. People sort of opening creches in shops. Who'd have thought that would end up with questions at the Treasury Select Committee with Google, Amazon, and Starbucks having to answer for why they don't pay tax. We're a low-taxing country. So is that where the deficit is? And just to give you an idea of this is it's interesting what's happened with our taxation. And I think this is the difference between fairness and equality, by the way. And that is that in 1975, the highest rate of tax, I was going to set this as a question, this is the audience participation bit. Do you know what the high rate of tax was in 1975? Don't look up there. 82%. So it was 82%. The basic rate of tax was 30%. There wasn't really VAT then. There was something called purchase tax, but it wasn't on everything. It was on sort of luxury items. It was patchy. It wasn't on everything. So what's happened since then? What's happened since then? What's happened since then is that we've changed the balance of our taxation from progressive taxation, which is the more you earn, the more you pay, right? That's gone down from 82% down to 50%. It's coming down to 45% in the next budget. And if the government has its way, I'm sure it'll be 40% before the next election. So that's come down by half, more or less. At the same time, the basic rate of taxation has come down to 20%. But we've introduced VAT, which is a tax on what we spend on our shopping, and that's gone up to 20%. That's gone up to 20%. That's regressive taxation. So regardless of how much you earn, you pay the same tax. So if you buy a CD, it doesn't matter whether you earn £1 million, whether you earn £10,000, you pay the same tax on it. That's regressive taxation. So since 1975 till today, we've changed the base of our taxation from progressive taxation to regressive taxation. And you know what that means? That means that there's only one way of looking at it, isn't it? That people who were paying, I'm sure they weren't all paying it, people who were paying 82% tax in 1975 have got more disposable income today than they did 30 years ago. They've got more disposable income today than they've got 30 years ago. They've got more money to pay tax on, haven't they? Have they not? There's more income, there's capacity there for people to pay more tax at the very high end of our income. But what's happened is, and bears it out, this is the UN report on human development. And this is a calculation that's worked out by an Italian economist called Gini. It's called the Gini coefficient. And all you need to understand about this graph is, as you can see, from about the same period that our taxation moved from progressive to regressive taxation, that our country became more unequal. Our country became more unequal. You can see the red line going up is telling us, that's what it's telling us. We're now, the UN report on economic development that reported last December, the OECD even, that reports on human development and is saying the same thing. We are almost the most unequal society in the industrialized world. We've become the most unequal society in the industrialized world. And that tells us that at the top end, there is more capacity for people to pay tax. So what really caused the deficit? Well, I think we'll refer to Mervyn King, who's the governor of the Bank of England. He's our chief banker. He's our main banker in the country. And he told us, as you can see here, that the money that we spent bailing out the banks had nothing to do with overspending. It had to do with the fault of the financial services sector. But we all know that, don't we? I mean, on the one hand, we sort of slag the banks off, and then on the other hand, we're told it's overspending has caused all these problems, and we need to redress it. The problem in the economy was caused by the financial services sector. I mean, I can go into more detail later if you want with questions and things. But what I want to do here very quickly is just draw a distinction. I want to draw a distinction between how the banking deficit was dealt with, and I'll explain what I mean by that, to how our public sector deficit is being dealt with. Now, when the banks were making all their investments in the subprime mortgages in the United States and all that, they ended up owning so much of this toxic, worthless debt that they owed out. RBS Bank, for example, owed 35 times more than it was worth. 35 times more than it was worth. Now, all the other banks were in the same position. And we were told, and I bought it, and I don't know whether it's right or it's not, by the way, we were told if we don't bail the banks out, we're not going to be able to get cash out of the ATM machines. I don't know if any of you are fans of Mary Poppins, but I would recommend you watch Mary Poppins in a different light. In Mary Poppins, Mr. Dawes, who owns the Fidelity Fiduciary Bank, there's a scene in it where he's trying to grab tuppence off Michael Banks, the other little boy Mary Poppins had given him to feed the birds. So while he's doing that, he says, stand the banks, England stands. Fall the banks, England falls. And he's tottering around, and the other guys in waistcoats and top hats trying to keep him standing up. But that's the argument we were told. Alistair Darling, and read it, and it's in his book, but I wouldn't recommend that you read it, is that he was saying the same thing. If we don't bail out RBS Bank, the world banking system's going to collapse. So we, as a country, had to decide how much we needed to put into the banks to keep them afloat. So in a sense, we were working out what the banking deficit was. And we worked it out, that it was 900 and... it was worked out at £955 billion. So we, as a country, through all sorts of different schemes, we put £955 billion behind the banks. At the time, that was more than our deficit. It's only just under what our deficit is now. But that's what we were willing to put behind the banks. Now, it was actually, to be honest, it was equal at the time. This is 4 years ago. This was equal to what our whole GDP was as a country then. That's what we were willing to do. Now, this does raise some interesting questions, which is, when's the banking deficit going to get paid off? Yeah, when are we going to get our money back? Well, are we giving them 4 years? Are we saying to the banks, we're lending you all this money, but you've got to reduce your banking deficit in total in 4 years? Are we saying that? No, we're not saying that. This is just a paragraph from a report by the National Audit Commission, and it's basically saying we don't know when the banks are going to be able to pay us back our money. RBS Bank, I don't know if you noticed this, but RBS Bank produced its quarterly results the other week, and they're still losing money. So we're not saying to the banks, sorry, you've got to pay it back in 4 years. We're saying, well, we just pay it back when you can. And more than that, we're saying that in order to keep the banks going, we need to pump money into them. We need to pump money into them. The bank started off by saying about quantitative easing, which is basically the Bank of England by giving a cash injection to our banks to the value of £375 billion. Now, why are they not saying, let's put a cash injection of £375 billion into our economy, into our public services, pay off some of our private debt, reduce some of our mortgage payments to stimulate public investment in houses and schools and roads and hospitals? So the banking system, it's all right to say, pump the money in, pay it back when you can. From the public sector's concerned, they say, no, you've got to reduce the amount of money. We've got to have an austerity program. There's a complete difference between how the both things are being treated. So that brings us to the point where we have to think about whether we need to have the cuts. Are these economic decisions or not? Is it on the basis of our debt? Well, our debt doesn't appear to be high, does it? It's not. It's low historically. It's low compared to all our trading partners. Growth plays a key role. We've seen that. Slumping growth leads to deficit. Increasing growth leads to a closing deficit. We've seen that. What would happen if we had steady growth of 3% every year for the next 3-4 years? What would that do to our deficit without making any cuts whatsoever? I never hear anyone talking about that. That's why Paul Krugman, one of the Nobel Prize winning economists, said it's jobs now, because there's an employment deficit. Jobs now, deficit later. Tax is lagging behind spending. There's a tax gap. We saw that, 100 billion, bit more. So it's a cash flow problem. Why can't we borrow short term? It's cheap over a long period. Why can't we borrow short term until it catches back up with our spending again? So that suggests, is national debt our problem with our deficit? I don't think so. Is the deficit a problem in terms of our spending is too much? Well, I think that depends on your values. That depends on our values, what we want to spend our money on as a country. Is there an issue of economic governance? Well, there is, because we know that because of what's happened with the financial services sector and the banks. There's certainly an employment deficit. There's certainly a banking deficit. But more than that, there's a democratic deficit. I'm not an economist. And I'll just tell it, this is partly probably why. There's a guy called Dr. Lawrence Peter who said, an economist is an expert who'll know tomorrow while the things he predicted yesterday didn't happen today. So there's a democratic deficit because all this information, all this stuff about economy stops us engaging in a debate about it. It stops us if students demonstrating a year, 18 months ago for over tuition fees were told by journalists, by the way. By journalists, this isn't just a political issue. This is the media that's selling us the narrative. It was saying, well, okay, if we don't increase tuition fees, what are we going to cut to make up the difference? That's not a debate. That's just the same argument. What about saying, we don't have to do that, or we can borrow and let's do something else with it? There's lots of, there's more than one option. And I found this is the point, because it's sold to us as if, and this will go to your heart and soul, as Margaret Thatcher said in an Observer in 1982, is that this is being sold to us because we're told economics is a science. It's a neutral science. These things have to take place in certain ways because they're technical issues. They're things that happen in a particular way. It's very technical and scientific. Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt, when he made his, I can't imagine this happening today, but when he made his acceptance speech at the Democrat Convention in 1932, said exactly this. He said, while they parade, while they go on about economic laws, men and women are starving. We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature. They're made by human beings. They're made by human beings. And that makes us think that we need to, as a people and as a country, we need to think about what kind of country we want. You know, do we want free health service? Do we want fuel allowance for pensioners? Do we want houses, cheap, affordable houses that people can afford to buy? Or do we not want that? That's what the kind of debate that we need to have about our country. And when we decide that, we fix our economics, our economic policy to deliver it. We don't do it the other way around. After all, when our debt, I remind you, was 238% in 1946, we did it then, didn't we? So we can do it again in 2012. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay. Ready to answer your questions. Please, a big round of applause for Barry Kushner.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. Well, I get the feeling that I'm going to be quite in demand with this microphone, because walking around talking to you while I was trying to rob you of your cash, you all had a lot of questions. So I want you to put your hand nice and high in the air so I can see you. I'll try and go to different people, so if you've got a couple of questions, I'll try and make it back to you as we go. I'll give you the microphone, you'll say your name, you'll ask your question, Barry will answer it, we'll all enjoy it, and we'll move along, and that's how that's going to go. So I will start here. It is on.
Well, hello, my name's David Cameron. No.
Hello, David.
It's Colin.
Colin Cameron.
Thank you, Geraint. No, not Colin Cameron. No. Two things. Very good talk. And what do you think the ideology is of this Conservative-led government? And secondly, as there's an awful lot of debt around the world, what do you think about the possibility of everyone getting together and scrubbing the whole lot and wiping the slate clean and starting again?
Okay, well, I'll start by saying I'm not an economist. Well, okay. I think the answer to your first question, I think, is a bit broader than that. I think we can take a view that this government is redrawing the post-war settlement around between government and its people, and around taxation and public services and welfare state and all that. But I think there's a bit more fundamental thing going on here. And I think, and I was talking to someone before, economics is not a science, it's an ideology. I think if you see science as an ideology, it's in a different way. Economics was never a subject on its own. Adam Smith, who's credited as being the father of economics, was a moral philosopher. And the root of economics is in moral philosophy. Now, as it happens, his moral philosophy was the best, most equitable way for societies to develop. It's just that he was thinking before society and capitalism evolved, industrial society evolved, he wasn't to know how it was going to turn out. You know, if he was the ghost of Christmas future, economics future, he might have thought about it in a different way. But he was a moral philosopher. And I think that what we've seen, you could argue, is up until the early 1970s, you could see that economics was driven by people who at the heart of their philosophy was social justice. You have people like Keynes, Roosevelt, Harold Macmillan. Dare I say, these people witnessed depression, unemployment. Unemployment was an anathema to them, even Harold Macmillan, which is why he took issue with Margaret Thatcher. But that was a philosophy that held sway up until the mid-1970s, when free market economics started to take hold. And I would argue that that is more or less still around today. So the government is at probably the worst end of that, because I think it is. I think it believes in the things that it's doing. The economy will right itself. Unemployment is a byproduct of it. Creative destruction is an essential element of the way economies grow. Businesses have to close for new ones to develop. But and they believe the hand of government is a negative influence rather than, as people like Keynes and people like him, so it's a positive influence. So I think there's a distinction which is broader than just this government, but I think this government holds that philosophy and relief to see it very clearly. Should we write off all the debt? Well, well, probably there has to be, it would make sense for there to be an international solution, wouldn't there? I think, we can't have Keynes, as I said before, Keynes warned of private businesses interfering in government policy, and what we have are German banks, French, Spanish banks, as I said before to someone, are interfering in Greek government policy because they hold Greek debt, so they need Greece to be able to pay them back what they owe them, so they're forcing their government decisions. So I think in that sense, yeah, you're right. Iceland had 3 banks, and they were the first to be hit by the credit crunch, really, or amongst the first. They were hugely over leveraged, hugely, Icelandic banks. Given it's a country with 350,000 people living in it, the amount of money that went through Icelandic banks was unbelievable. The Icelandic bank, the Icelandic government, when they crashed, subject to protest by its people, decided to let those banks fail, actually. It wrote debt off, actually. So that's another option. It wrote the debt off and invested in reducing people's mortgages by 40%, reducing their private debt. It invested in people, not in those institutions. So is that kind of answer to your question?
Excellent. Because I'm lazy, I'm going to go here for the next question, because it means I don't have to move.
Hi, Barry. Great talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
My name's Paul Mylart. I'm a telecoms engineer. We spoke during the break, and I raised 2 things with you: quantitative easing, the gold standard, and as I said, my thinking was QE, eventually the only thing down the line is inflation, and why the hell did we ever come off the gold standard, and should we indeed go back to the gold standard, and what are the disadvantages of the gold standard? Thank you.
I don't know. I think the gold standard, I mean, I'm not an economist, so you're testing me here, but the gold standard, we had a chat about it, the gold standard was, the last country to come off the gold standard was America, the United States. President Nixon took off gold standard in 1975, I think it was. But the gold standard was a way of pegging all the currencies around the world to the dollar. So the dollar was backed by the value of gold in Fort Knox, which is why it's got such mythical status, or it did have. And then all the other countries would value their currencies in relation to the dollar. So I think the gold standard was very important for that reason. I think what you were getting at is that what's happening in terms of investment and what we do with money is not invested in real things. So we're creating money, as 97% of the money created in our economy is not created by the Bank of England. They're created by our banks, our high street banks. They create money. When they give us a loan, they create money. When they give us a mortgage, they're creating money. So that banks create money, 97% of money in our economy, not the Bank of England. The problem is, I would suggest, is that that money that the banks have got has been invested in investment packages, investments that more technical term, mortgage-backed securities. These are investments that are backed up by the fact that someone somewhere is paying a mortgage over 20, 25 years. But they wrap all these things up and they become an investment. So actually the banks aren't even buying a house. They're buying an investment based on a house, or they're buying an insurance product that's insuring an investment that is based on somebody buying a house. So these things are not real. They're not buying a car. They're not investing in a manufacturing business that's going to produce a car that's got real value. It's not investing in a digital business that's creating something real. These are all things are the problem, investing in things that have no intrinsic value. So I think in that way, I would say it's more an argument really about that. Why I wouldn't say it would be linked to gold standard is because the difference between Britain and Greece, one of the differences, is that Greece doesn't have a national bank. You know, it's been the Eurozone. There's a European bank. So Greece can't generate money in its economy if it wants to, as a government. Yeah, we can. So so that gives us the opportunity for us, if we want to, if we choose to as a country, we can say, right, we're going to spend £10 billion, we're going to build £10 billion worth of houses, for example. Now, if you were limited in doing that because it had to be matched by, you have the right amount of gold in a vault, I'm not sure that would be the right thing or not. Whether your second question was about quantitative easing. Now, the argument that's made, and I don't know the answer to this, genuinely, but the argument that the Bank of England would say is that we're not printing money because that money only has a lifespan of 10 years because it's buying a government bond. It's like a promissory note.
They don't actually print money, do they?
No, they don't print money. It's a book transaction.
There's no more paper in the system afterwards than before. It's just Bank of England.
Yeah, it is, but they've just, I mean, Japan has done quantitative easing, which is again similar. But what they've done is they've used that to give money to individual people, to people like us. So we feel the benefit of quantitative easing, not the bank's bank balance, not their balance sheet. So I think it's probably how it's done. It may create inflation if it stimulates demand. It's not doing that now. So I think that's probably the link, because obviously pump money into the economy, people have money in their pockets, they go rush to the shops, prices go up. That's the theory, but whether that will happen in this case or not, I don't know. 10 years' time, that money gets paid back theoretically by the government and it disappears.
Okay, perfect. I know we've got a lot of questions to get through, so we'll try and move through them as quickly as possible.
I'll answer shorter.
We've got two here, and if we can keep any follow-ups as small as possible, or try and avoid follow-ups, we can always do that after we've all finished asking questions. But if we want to start here.
Okay. Hi, Barry. Again, thanks for your talk tonight. I'm kind of speaking as an employee of HMRC, the tax administration, and I know you've said you're not an economist. I just wanted to query your definition of the tax gap, because you seem to put it as tax that could have been collected, whereas HMRC, we put it as tax that should have been collected, and we put the official tax gap of 42 billion.
No, I'm talking about two different things. Right, that's a different point, but well made. But what I was saying was that, what I meant was that if the economy would have continued to grow as it was forecast to, then you would have forecast that it would generate a certain amount of taxable income into government. But because the country went into a slump and people lost their jobs and weren't paying tax, the amount of money that they would have paid, they can't pay because they're not in work anymore, fell. So the tax gap, what I'm talking about, was the difference between the tax we're taking now and what we would have taken had the economy continued to grow. That's what I meant. What you're talking about is quite right, and there's another issue, again, is that where the deficit lies, which is the tax gap, and it varies between, you know, what you're saying to 120 billion pounds in a year in terms of taxes that are avoided paying by Starbucks, Arcadia, Google, Amazon, all these companies, Lloyd's Bank, you know, so that you pay that generate profits of 3 billion, or do a turnover, but only pay 100 odd billion pound in tax, so £1 million. So that tax gap is different, and is around tax avoidance. But I agree with what you're saying.
Hi, my name's Mike. One big question I always have is, why does nobody, when we're talking about all these economics, ever go, well, that's not what we did last time? This guy Keynes, we named a town after him because he did such a good job. And we've done the exact opposite of what we did last time there was the Great Depression. And everybody seems to have forgotten about him. I don't hear his name mentioned, acres of newsprint, loads of interviews. Nobody talks about him.
Well, I mean, as part of this sort of campaign that I've done with my brother over all this, we wrote to the BBC quite a number of times, and you know, been on 5 live phone-ins and you and yours, and pestering broadcasters to sort of try and raise this issue. Now, we asked the BBC why can't the BBC represent a broad range of analysis around the economy, because it's just broadly representing one, you know, which is that we're in a debt crisis. So the answer that we got back was that, you know, we can't deal with every academic strand of opinion, and it gets a bit too confusing for us, for them to talk about that. Now, I mean, that was in a letter in the end that came from the BBC governors, by the way. I mean, they've got more on the plate now than they had dealing with me and my brother at the time, I have to say. But I think the point is that these people like Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, Christopher Pissarides, and there are others who were saying before, these are not just people that are associated on the left politically. People like Martin Wolf, who's the finance editor for the Financial Times. Andrew Tyree, who's the chair, the Conservative chair of the Treasury Select Committee, who said that, you know, George Osborne was over-egging it when he said we're on the brink of bankruptcy. Boris Johnson has made comment to it. Ed Balls, before the leadership election, Labour leadership election, made a fantastic speech in Bloomberg over in New York about his analysis of the economy and lessons to be learnt from the past. The point is that what concerns me, the reason why we did this, is not because there's a fiscal deficit, but because there's a democratic deficit. Yeah, because when these different opinions and analyses aren't there for us to talk about. You know, half of this information is it's there if you dig around for it, but why should you have to do that? You know, people like Evan Davis, you know, the Radio 4 presenter, is an economist who used to work for the Fiscal Studies Institute. So he knows his economics very well. He understands it clearly. But why aren't these questions being put for? Why did Andrew Marr not challenge George Osborne when he was on his programme the week before he unveiled all these cuts in this austerity programme in 2010? Why didn't he challenge him when Osborne said we're on the brink of bankruptcy? But these are all parts of the same argument, and I think it's because this is a narrative that's been sold. We were sold another one over the Iraq War, were we not? You know, so you know, we sold that these narratives are generated. I think it started with Alistair Darling. I think it's continued and picked up by the Conservatives. The Lib Dems have bought into it very nicely. The people who are selling it to us are the BBC and IT. I don't want to be too critical of the BBC, but the BBC, ITV journalists, there's a general mood about what the discussion should be about without reference to all these things. People like Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, Christopher Pissarides, they're not at the extreme, some random academic strand. These are leaders of a different type of economic philosophy. It's just that they're not considered as such in the current political consensus.
Okay, great. I know we've got a question down the front here and one over there. I always do wonder how much of these problems are caused by the fact that the invisible hand of the market has an invisible middle finger.
Yeah, it's a very interesting talk and a lot of useful information. I have a slightly different angle on it, and the one economist or person you don't talk about is Marx, Karl Marx. It's all right quoting Keynes, Krugman, all these other people, but the problem that you don't appear to address is the power of capital. So all your talk is framed with our economy, our country, our national debt, what we have to do and what our alternatives are. I don't feel like it's our debt or our economy. I don't feel I have any ownership in it at all, and that's primarily what Marx was talking about. Who owns and controls the economy? Not just our economy or the British economy, the economy internationally throughout Europe. So yes, exactly that. And it's where they get that power from, the power of capital, that you don't appear to address. Why do the government react as they do, that we have to have cuts are set? Because the financial markets dictate to our government just as much as they do to the Eurozone governments. So our government will take the decisions independently of the Eurozone, but the pressures are equally there, the power of the financial markets. So you can see this week, France, Hollande, the president, elected on an anti-austerity program against cuts, against VAT, etc., this week is announcing increases in VAT and public expenditure cuts. Now, to me, that indicates the power is elsewhere. It's the power of capital. I'm not saying people should put up with what they've got, but unless they address that problem, which you don't really address either, then the problems will continue.
Okay, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you, but I think what I'm trying to do is, and what we've sort of been concerned with, is the fact that, you know, this whole debate is being framed really by, I mean, from the banks down, to be honest. I mean, if we're the patsy for bailing banks out, then the only way you can start to deal with that is by breaking down the economic arguments that they're making to justify what they were doing. I mean, I think that what I'm trying to suggest is that the arguments that are being marshalled, and this isn't a conspiracy by the financial services. We've seen it. We've seen them they're on TV. There are people like Bob Diamond. There are people like Mervyn King. We know their names now. We didn't know their names probably 10 years ago. It's not a conspiracy, and we know the pressure is coming from them because we know they looked in the whites of Alistair Darling's eyes and made him bail out the banks. So we're told that we had to do that because otherwise the whole world would collapse. Now, I'm not sure whether that's true, but what I am sure of is that's something that we, as a democratic country, should be able to debate. Should be able to debate it. I'm not saying that making cuts isn't a legitimate political point of view. It is. I'm not saying having financial influence from finances isn't legitimate to argue. It is. But so is the argument to say that that shouldn't happen. And so is the argument to say, hang on a minute. These cuts aren't going to mean that by 2015 or 2017 when it stops, that the health service will go back to what it was before, because it isn't. It doesn't mean that our local authority here is going to get its 50% of its budget back in 2015, because it's not. These things have gone. These things are going. These things are gone without us debating them. And one of the, and the debate can be, you're right. The ownership of, if you wanted to argue the ownership of capital, the ownership of industry, redistribution of wealth, they are legitimate arguments for us to have, and that's why I think that you've got to start where you start. I'm not coming here to argue that point of view. I'm here to argue that we need to be able to have a debate about it, because we don't want to talk about economics. We don't need to talk about economics. We just need to understand what is being said so we can move it to one side with the comfort of knowing that we can have a debate about what our country should look like. Before it's too late, yeah.
It's too late. I'm Dave Worrell. I'd like to ask about probably a more fundamental question, really. I think you've got like the nasty party, and they're focused on growth, and you've got the lovely Labour Party, and they're focused on growth. So I would like to question growth. Is that a valid aim to have, given that any kind of percentage growth will inevitably end up in exponential chaos? So do you think growth is a valid aim to have, or should we just kind of take stock, try and redistribute what we've got and just level off a little bit?
Maybe. Well, no, but maybe let's have a conversation about it. I mean, maybe, if we decided to, there's an issue that gross domestic product doesn't measure a lot of the things that we hold dear. It doesn't measure, for example, the reduction in natural resources, for example. It doesn't measure that, but that's actually quite important. So so there are issues around all these kind of things, but on the other hand, yeah, we could invest in a green car, we could invest in renewable technology if we choose to as a country, and that can be part of an investment in the country. I think the arguments, I think it's an argument to be had. I mean, it may be, what kind of growth do we want is part of the question. I mean, the growth we've had probably in recent years has been one just based on people accumulating wealth. But should we have one around based on, on the development of the better, for the betterment of us as a people and as a country. So so there are arguments to be had. I don't disagree with that.
Okay, I think we've got probably our last question, unless there's a burning desire to add one more. I don't want to keep our speaker on stage too long. He's put in a good shift so far. But we'll go here for our question. If anyone has another one, put their hands up in the next 10 seconds or we're done.
Okay. Hi, I'm Tom. I'm going to say something slightly critical. Do you think it's fair to compare now to what happened after the war? Because after the war, we went from a war economy to a post-war economy, and of course we have the Marshall Plan, a huge amount of aid from the USA. So, so yes, our debt was a lot higher after the war, but is it fair to compare then to now?
I don't know. What do you think? I mean, why is it not? I mean, if we're not coming out of a period of war, but we are. The war came after a long period of depression. I mean, I think if I'll come back to your point, but if we as a country decide what our priorities are, and we we come up with an economic policy to address them, is the most pressing thing for us as a people the difference between what our government brings in for the time being in income and what it spends, or is it whether people have a job or not, or whether they have a good job or not, or whether somebody will suffer ill health or will die because the hospitals aren't funded well enough or not. So those are the kind of questions that we should ask. And in a way, where I would compare it is that in 1946 or 1945, we wanted to build a country that was fit for heroes. That wanted to build a country that was worth fighting for. So it was much more extreme than it is now. We're not fighting in that way, but we have children, we have parents, we have grandparents. What kind of life do we want for them? Do we want a life that's fit for them? Now they're the same kind of questions I think that were asked post-war, but post-war, if we'd have, and Ed Miliband said this when he was on when he was on Question Time prior to the leadership election, said that if our only economic priority had been in 1946 was to reduce our deficit and our debt, then we wouldn't have built the welfare state, we wouldn't have built houses and hospitals and schools. So it's the same, you could make the same argument legitimately, I think, today. So I think it is fair. But I would say that, because I did. I think it was fair of me.
Excellent. Well, I think we've probably had enough questions. So thank you, everyone, for all your fantastic questions. And thanks once again, huge round of applause to Barry Kushner, a fantastic talk.
Thank you very much.